Hello and welcome to my video all about the fair isle knitting technique. Now honestly, the real reason that I got into knitting in the first place was because I wanted to do the fair isle knitting technique. But I didn't have the patience to learn all the different techniques I needed in order to give it a go. So what I did was kind of a simplified version of fair isle, which meant that even as a beginner, I could accomplish the patterns that I wanted to. So that's what this video is all about. I'm going to teach you the fair isle method that I used whilst I was a beginner, which meant I could dive straight into the fair isle technique without even having to know both the Continental and English styles of knitting. If you've seen any other fair isle video lessons, you'll notice that everyone uses the technique where you use the English method for the right hand and the Continental knitting method in the left hand. This is the quicker and more efficient way of doing it, but the way I'm going to show you means that you don't have to learn the second knitting method before you give it a go. Now I'm just going to give you a little fair isle introduction to start with, and then I'm going to go into the method. So what exactly is fair isle? Well, first of all, it's a stranding technique. Now stranding is the process of carrying yarn across the back of your work. So in the fair isle technique, you'll see that on the back side of your knitted work, there will be horizontal pieces of yarn that are kind of floating across the back of your work. These, incidentally, are called floats. In a fair isle pattern, you may use several different colours of yarn. However, on any particular row of fair isle, there will only be one or two colours used in that one row. You never use more than 2 colours per row of fair isle. Fair isle produces a distinctive repeating pattern, often symmetrical, across your knitted work. And you'll often find the technique used in wearable items like jumpers and scarves. So let's get going with the technique. For my demonstration, I'm just going to be using white and red yarn and doing a very simple pattern. To do this technique, you will need to be able to cast on and cast off, knit and purl, and also change the colour of your yarn. If you're unsure about any of these techniques, please take a quick look at my other video lessons. As you can see, I already have done several rows of ribbing in white, then done a red stripe before going back to the main colour, which is white. You can just ignore all of this previous knitting and go from just a cast on edge. So all you have to do is cast on the number of stitches you want to use and then knit along with me. This is purely for practice rather than creating a complete project. So the first thing I've done is knit a few stitches with the main colour. And now I'm going to join the red yarn to my knitting. To do this, you can use whatever method you like to join the new ball of yarn. In this example, I'm going to do a slip knot around the white yarn with the red yarn. And to do this, you simply do a slip knot like you normally would, but with the white yarn in the centre. The advantage with a slip knot is that you can slide the yarn over each other and easily undo the knot with one pull of the yarn. On my video all about how to knit stripes, I made a loop in the end of the new yarn and simply worked it into the knitting without adding any kind of knot. There are a few different ways of doing it, so use your preferred method or just follow along with this method I'm going to show you now. So to do the slip knot, you simply put the red yarn under the white yarn like so and create a loop in the red yarn. You then bring this part of the red yarn through the loop and pull tight. As you can see, the slip knot can move along the white yarn like so, and also be undone very easily. A knot is not absolutely necessary for adding a new colour of yarn. You may prefer to do it a different way. However, the knot simply keeps the yarn tail in place and ready to be woven in later. So, the first step is to slide the knot in the red yarn all the way over to the left and as close to the needles as you can get it. When you lift up your needles, you'll find that you have the white working yarn and the red working yarn, as well as the loop of red yarn and the red yarn tail. Just ignore the red loop and red tail. You just want to concentrate on the working yarns, which are the pieces attached to the balls of yarn. And then you simply start knitting with the red yarn. The knot holds the red yarn in place, so you don't have to worry about it. You just start knitting with the red yarn. I'm just going to do one single stitch in red, and then I'm going to move back to the white colour again. To go back to the white, I take my hand underneath the red yarn and pull the white yarn in front of the red. So I take the white yarn under and in front of the red yarn. This gives it a little bit of security because it sort of does a half twist with the red yarn. Some people do a full twist by wrapping one colour of yarn all of the way around the other, just to make it extra secure, but that's unnecessary. You really don't have to do that. It's plenty secure, just doing a half twist that I'm doing here, just by taking the white yarn under and in front of the red. And then you simply start knitting with the white yarn again. I find Fair Isle quite deceptive in that the end result often looks quite intricate, but the technique is actually quite simple. So I'm just knitting 4 stitches of the white, trying to not let the red loop of yarn get in my way. And then once you've done 4 or 5 stitches in the main colour, i.e. white in this case, you can then undo the knot in the red yarn. Now you have 2 white stitches, 1 red and 4 white stitches. So simply lay your work down and pull on the red yarn tail to release the knot. This will stop the red yarn getting in your way so much, and it's done its job now. It's kept the red yarn secure, and now we've just got a tail of yarn. You can cut the tail now if you wish, like I'm doing, but make sure you have at least 6 inches left. I've probably cut mine a little bit short, but you want more like 6 to 8 inches of tail left, so you can weave it into your work later. And then you can get back to knitting. And then I knit 1 more stitch in red yarn, going into the next stitch with my right hand knitting needle, taking the red yarn under and in front of the white yarn, and then knitting that 1 stitch. As I said before, some people wrap the secondary colour yarn around the main colour of yarn, but this really isn't necessary. And once I've done that 1 red stitch, I go back to doing 4 more white stitches. And now I'm just going to show you the back of the work so far. Because you've done 3 red stitches, you should have 2 floats across the back of your work. These red floats are only connected to your work where the red stitches are. At every other point, they're just loose. One thing you have to note when doing Fair Isle is to make sure that the floats don't end up too loose or too tight. To stop the floats being too tight, make sure that you regularly spread your stitches out when you're knitting. If the stitches remain bunched up the whole time you're knitting, the floats are most likely to become too tight and create puckers in your work. As long as the floats aren't too long, then you shouldn't have a problem with them being too loose. You just have to keep an eye on the floats to make sure that if there are any problems, you can remedy them straight away. So here I am, just knitting the next 4 white stitches. And now I'm going to show you the biggest problem with this simplified version of Fair Isle. The issue is that the yarns end up getting all twisted, because what you're doing is constantly bringing one yarn in front of the other, and this creates the twists in the yarn, which can make a bit of a tangle. It's not hard to control, you just have to untwist the yarns quite regularly. I've just knit in exactly the same pattern that I was doing, so that's 4 white stitches, 1 red stitch, over and over until the end of the row. And here is that finished row. The next thing you can do is weave in the red yarn tail. You don't have to do this, in fact you can leave all of the yarn tails to weave in at the end of your project if you wish. If you do want to weave it in now, however, the idea of weaving in is simply to blend in the yarn tail as well as secure it in place. You could just secure it by knitting it anywhere into the back of your work, but it looks a lot better to blend it in. And to do this, you simply follow the path already taken by red yarn in your knitted work. So here I'm just using a yarn needle to guide the yarn tail along the same path as previously taken by red yarn in my work. And I do about 4 or 5 loops before I then cut off the excess of the yarn tail. I'm only showing the start of weaving in here, and if you would like to learn more, please have a look at my weaving in video on my channel. And now I'm going to do one more row of Fair Isle. Because I'm doing stockinette stitch, all of the stitches on this second row will be purl stitches. I'd like you to note at this point that the red yarn leaves your knitting part way into your work, not at the edge. I will come back to this point later. So all I'm doing now is 7 white purl stitches. And now I'm going to switch to the red colour to do 3 purl stitches. To do this, the red yarn must be to the left of the white yarn. So instead of taking the red yarn from the right hand side and knitting with it, you take it under and to the left of the white yarn. The way you change yarn colours when you're knitting Fair Isle should always be consistent throughout every row. So however you choose to change yarn colours, always stick to that method. There are probably other methods of doing it, but this is the way I do it and it does seem to work. So then I do 3 purl stitches with the red yarn. So once I've done those 3 red stitches, I move on to the white yarn again. So I take the white yarn to the left hand side by going under the red yarn. I then purl 11 stitches in white. Now this is a lot of stitches to do without once picking up the red yarn, and the result of that is that you'll have a really long float on the back of your work once you start working with the red yarn again, which I'm going to demonstrate now by doing 3 more red stitches. So once I've done those red stitches, you can see that the float is now really long, 11 stitches long to be exact, and that is too long to be practical on the back of your work because it'll get caught on things. So now I'm going to demonstrate what you should do when you've got a long length of stitching that's in the main colour. Now I'm going to do 13 white purl stitches in a row, but halfway through that I'm going to stop and twist the white yarn together with the red yarn. So I purl 6 stitches in the white, and then I wrap the white yarn clockwise all of the way around the red yarn. So I purl 6 stitches in white, and then I wrap the white yarn all of the way around the red yarn. This anchors the red yarn to your knitted work, and you can see the twist here. I then carry on knitting with the white yarn and do 7 more purl stitches. This makes a total of 13 white stitches in a row, but at the back you'll see that the float has been broken up into 2 floats. One 6 stitches long and one 7 stitches long. So anytime you're doing Fair Isle and you've got a long run of stitches in the main colour, you're going to want to do this twist in the yarn at least once. You don't really want to have a float that's more than about 5 or 6 stitches long. Just going to finish off that row by doing 3 more red stitches, then 11 white, 3 red, and then the rest of the stitches are white. And here you can see the Fair Isle pattern now taking shape on the front of your work. Once you've mastered this simplified technique as a beginner, you can then improve your skills to improve your Fair Isle technique. A couple of things you can do to improve are to use the proper technique, which is the accepted way of doing Fair Isle, where you use both the Continental knitting style and the English knitting style at the same time, one on each hand. This will eliminate the twisting of the yarns that you get with the technique I've just shown you. One more improvement you can make is to make sure the yarn is carried from the very first stitch to the very last stitch in each row. So in this example, the red yarn would be carried along the back of your work from the very first stitch to the very last on every single row. At one point in this video, I noted that the red yarn leaves the back of your work part way into your knitting, so not right at the edge. The reason I pointed this out is because in the proper technique, what you're supposed to do is carry that red yarn all of the way across each row at the back of your work, and the way you do this is by doing that twist that I showed you, using the white yarn to anchor the red yarn to your work. So even if you're not using the red yarn at the end of each row, you would twist the white yarn with the red just to carry the red yarn to the edge of your work. These additions aren't vital to get the Fair Isle pattern. As I've shown you, it works perfectly well with this simplified version. However, I will do a video on the proper and accepted way of doing Fair Isle, and you'll be able to see these things in action. Thank you very much for watching my video, and I really hope you've managed to follow along.